Good morning. If I can please have you take your seats. I know we have already had quite the program with very few breaks, but we'd like to get started in 1 minute, so please take your seats. Good morning again. My name is Carrie Warwick Smith, and I'm the Vice President for Public Policy for the Association of Community College Trustees. I'm thrilled that we had such a grand start to our 2023 National Legislative Summit, and I appreciate you're all coming so early this morning and being willing to stay in this ballroom for so many back-to-back sessions with us today. As you may have heard, the State of the Union is tomorrow night, and that definitely affected our agenda for NLS this year. So we were thrilled to be able to have so many speakers, but they all wanted to come on Monday and not on Tuesday. So for that reason, we have a packed schedule today, and we want to make sure that we stay on time. So to help us with that, we are going to get started, and we do need to stop firmly at 11:30. So I'm going to say this at the beginning, and I'm going to say it again at the end, that at 11:30, when we conclude the session, we need everyone to exit the ballroom as quickly as possible to allow the hotel staff to prepare for lunch. And along with my fellow panelists, we will be outside in the foyer area to answer any additional questions that we do not get to during the Q&A. So with that, let me introduce again, I am Carrie Warwick Smith, Vice President of Public Policy with ACCT. I am joined to my left by Jose Miranda, Director of Government Relations for ACCT. To his left, David Boehm, Senior Vice President, Government Relations with AACC. And on the end, Jim Hermes, Associate Vice President, Government Relations, AACC. So today we're really going through two main areas with you. We're going to start with a short section on the 118th Congress and the dynamics that we see for this new Congress now that they have mostly organized themselves and kicked off the next 2 years of work. And then we're going to spend the majority of the session going through the green sheet, also known as a one-pager. This is the menu of topics that we hope that you will use as you pursue your Hill meetings tomorrow and on Wednesday. We will close with question and answer, and again, reminders, which is to please exit swiftly at 11:30. So with that, I'm going to join my fellow panelists, and we will get started. So to start off, we're going to talk about the 118th Congress and the results that we see following the election that we had in November. So first, the biggest change is that the Republicans flipped the House so that they are now in the majority. They have the same slim majority that the Democrats had for the 117th Congress, 222 to 213 Democrats. In the Senate, though, when we move to the other side of the Hill, the Democrats actually increased the majority, flipping the Pennsylvania seat to now have a 51-49 edge, which is welcoming Senator Fetterman to Congress, which I hear our Pennsylvania colleges will get to meet with him this week. There has been one additional change to note. Senator Sinema, who's also meeting with our Arizona colleges this week, declared herself as an independent, but we still expect her to caucus with the Democratic Party. So what does this divided Congress mean? That will definitely cause a shift in the conversations that are happening here in Washington for the next 2 years, as President Biden will no longer have his party leading in both sides of the Congress. So first, we don't expect to see the large-scale spending bills that we saw in the 117th. We think those are less likely. As a reminder, appropriations bills need to be approved by both chambers, which means the White House and the Senate Democrats will have to come into agreement with House Republicans on the amount of federal funds that are being spent. Second, we expect the House will likely focus on oversight of the Biden administration and that we will see a lot of messaging bills that are partisan and are being put out to make points about policy agendas rather than bills that are actually likely to move forward. In particular, I'll note here that Representative Fox from Virginia, who is the returning chair of the House Education and Workforce Committee, has quipped that the Secretary Cardona and his team should get parking spaces on Capitol Hill because they are going to be coming for so many hearings. On the Senate side, we expect they will emphasize confirming Biden appointees to the judiciary and agencies, as that will give them some concrete outcomes in what is likely to be a tough legislative session. And then finally, for our work as associations and as colleges, we expect to spend much time on regulatory efforts. These are efforts that are solely within control of the Biden administration and will move forward regardless of any partisan divide, because we do expect that the president's legislative priorities, particularly in higher ed, will have a more difficult time advancing. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Jose to continue this conversation.
Thank you, Carrie. And the resulting elections also created a lot of shifts around congressional leadership. In the Senate, we saw the top two appropriators for both parties retiring, and that created a sort of domino effect on leadership for some of the key committees that we are going to be working with and that we have been historically always worked in. We have a new chair and ranking member on the Appropriations Committee. Senators Murray and Senators Collin will now be the two leads on the Senate for Appropriations. And with Senator Murray if you'll recall, Senator Murray was the chair of the Help Committee last Congress. With her now being the chair of the Appropriations Committee, that created a vacuum on the Help Committee. So we've also now seen new leadership on the Help Committee. We have Senator Sanders, who is an independent from Vermont, who caucuses with the Democrats. He will be the new Democratic lead as chair. And Senator Cassidy from Louisiana will be the new ranking member on the Republican side. So we have new leadership on both Appropriations and Help. One thing to note on the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Labor, Health and Human Services and Education is that with Senator Murray now being chair of the full committee, Senate rules prevent her likely from also being chair of the subcommittee. We expect, it's not official yet, but we expect Senator Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin to take the charge as chair of the subcommittee on the Democratic side, and then on the Republican side, we expect Senator Shelley Moore Capito from West Virginia to lead on the subcommittee for Republicans. On the House, we're seeing a little bit of the same, but with reverse roles. As Carrie mentioned, Congresswoman Fox will reprise her role as chairwoman that she had previously. Congressman Bobby Scott from Virginia will now become ranking member on the Education and Workforce Committee. And on the Appropriations Committee, we'll have Congresswoman Kay Granger from Texas be the chair on the full Appropriations Committee, and Congresswoman DeLauro from Connecticut reprise her role as ranking member on the full committee. There is a little bit of change at the subcommittee level. Congresswoman DeLauro will still be the top Democrat for the subcommittee, but we have a new chair on the Republican side, and that's Congressman Adderholt from Alabama. He is new to the subcommittee entirely, so it's going to take a little bit of establishing new relationships, but we are optimistic that we'll be able to work with him and his staff. Other than that, I just want to flag that there were a lot of retirements and there were also a lot of new faces, both at the subcommittee level and also just generally on Congress. So the four of us and the rest of our team have our work cut out in establishing new relationships with a lot of folks. So your meetings, especially if you're meeting with new members to key committees or freshman offices, will be really critical to helping us do our work. One more thing that I want to add on the committee rosters is if you've all checked in, which I assume probably all of you have your folder, and you will see a document there that's a congressional committee roster. You will also see that it's about 90% complete. Congress has had a bit of a slow start this year, and so as a result, we still don't have on the House side appointments for the Budget on Committee. And on the Senate side, we don't have the full subcommittee on Labor H on Republicans or Democrats. So that's still to come. We expect that to be announced and trickling in the coming days this week. But for the time being, we'll work with what has already been announced. And with that, I will turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, Jose, and thanks everyone for being here, and good to be with you this morning. We're going to turn now to the contents of the green sheet itself, and we're going to start out with the topic of workforce development. This is one area, we just listened to both Carrie and Jose talking about the dynamics of the Congress, and certainly many of those dynamics don't really lend themselves to a lot of major pieces of legislation getting done. We'll have to see how that plays out. But one area where we do see perhaps more hope for bipartisan work being done is in the area of workforce development. It is certainly the case that Representative Fox, Chairwoman Fox, returning to her chair as House and Education Workforce Committee, that she's very interested in moving forward on workforce development. Her Democratic colleagues on that committee marked up their own bill in the last Congress in terms of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. So, some hope there in terms of things moving forward. So as you see on your green sheet, we talk about two basic priorities in this area. One is to strengthen the role of community colleges in the workforce development system through a reauthorization of the act I just mentioned, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. This is the bill that authorizes the system that comprises of the workforce development boards at the local and state levels that many of you are involved in both those levels. It also comprises the one-stop job centers that go, America's Job Centers, that go by various other names in your state and local areas. And of course is one that our community colleges in many places are very heavily involved in. But we want to make that more of a uniform experience across the board for our colleges. So we, first of all, want to make sure that you are ensured a seat at that governance that I just mentioned, those state and local boards. We want to make sure that more training is actually happening through the system. So a lot of the resources that go into the WIOA system go into maintaining the infrastructure of the system. Now, obviously, a lot of that is because of the amount of funding that goes into these programs, but there are also changes to be made at the authorization level that can help put more of an emphasis on training within WIOA. And then finally, and probably most importantly for our colleges, because we hear time and time again from our colleges that they are not more involved or even really at all involved in the WIOA system, is because of the reporting requirements that come with putting your programs on what's called the eligible training provider list. So these are the lists that WIOA participants get, and from which they choose the programs that they're going to do training through. We want more community college programs to be on that list. And to do that, we realize that we need to streamline the reporting requirements that come along with being on that list. The second major component, and this kind of comes both within the WIOA reauthorization or potentially outside of it, is to authorize a major community college-led job training program. We're going to talk in just a second on the funding side about the Strengthening Community College Training Grants program, and that is certainly one thing that's already out there in terms of a community college-led job training program. It is relatively small in size at this point. We want to get back to where we have at least the authorization for, and we can argue for the funding for, a more major program along the lines of the TAC program, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Community College and Training Grants program. That could happen within the WIOA reauthorization. That is something that was in the Democrats' bill from last Congress. It could also happen in the form of a reauthorization of the TAC program itself. So not to get too worried about the exact vehicle or in the way in which it happens in terms of your message on the Hill over the next couple of days. Really the message has to be is that, as ever, your institutions are ready to play a major and leadership role in the workforce development needs of the country, and but do need that high-level support from the federal government in order to expand those programs that we have enjoyed in the past through programs like TACT. And then on the next slide, we do get into the first part of our funding agenda. we do see a lot of a lot of uncertainty in the road ahead in terms of funding. Obviously, that one of the first things that's going to come up and is already really very much the talk of the town is how we're going to move past the getting the debt ceiling taken care of. The President and Speaker McCarthy met the other day to begin conversations about that, but as of now, we have two sides. One side saying they want spending reductions in exchange for raising the debt ceiling, and the other side, the Democrats and the administration, saying that they are not going to negotiate over the debt ceiling at all. So that's going to be a big fight. In terms of the appropriations process, what we're likely to see at the end of the day is almost a reverse of what we've seen in past Congresses, whereas we will have bills coming out of the House, if they can get them passed with a slim majority, that will be, perhaps the low water mark in terms of funding levels, whereas before with the Democratic-controlled House, all the bills that came out of the House were the high water mark in terms of what we actually saw in final funding levels at the end of the day. To get any of these bills done, just as with any other piece of legislation, of course, they're going to have to pass the Senate, and that is going to require bipartisan support to do so. So the dynamic over on that side is not really all that much different, and for this as a whole, in order to pass appropriations bills, they eventually will have to be bills that will enjoy bipartisan support. So turning to the first part of our substantive agenda in terms of funding, support student access and success. I'm not going to go through every program that we have on the list here. There are a lot of them. One thing to say about that, and just in general, is we realize that there are a lot of funding priorities that we have on the green sheet. You're going to pick the ones when you talk about in your meetings that kind of have the most impact on your campus, ones that you have great stories to tell about in terms of your success in a particular grant program, or the ways in which the Pell Grant program help your students attend your institutions. All those stories are going to really feed into what exactly you prioritize at the end of the day in your meetings over the next couple of days. But we, of course, the top of our funding agenda does remain the Pell Grant program in terms of increases to the maximum award, which we've had great success in the last couple of years, $900 over the last 2 years. That remains a priority. Congress has been able to do that without actually raising funding for the program. But you see all the other programs that we're emphasizing here. TRIO and GEAR Up are incredibly important. Seed Campus has also enjoyed very bipartisan support recently and great funding success. We want to see that continue, along with the modifications to the program that allow the grants going to your institutions to be bigger to help you out in that area, the incredibly important area of childcare for the students that they need to attend your institutions. And then somewhat more, some of the newer kids on the block are these basic needs grants and the post-secondary student success grants, both housed in the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education program, which is kind of the catch-all program for a lot of different things. These are very small at the moment, but as we'll talk about over the course of this session, over the course of these couple of days, of course, these are both really great needs for our students. We already heard some of this from the speakers this morning, and we hope to grow these programs, quite a lot over the next couple of years, starting with this year in your messaging on the Hill. But I will turn it back to Jose, who will talk about some of our other funding priorities.
Thank you, Jim. And continuing along that vein, and you've heard today about how hard it's going to be to have a fight on appropriations this year or in the next 2 years. But the emphasis here is we can't allow our programs to be the ones that are sacrificial lambs. And so we want to make sure that you are still talking about the value of the programs and the funds you've received, the return on investment, and the impact it's having on our students. And so along those lines, we want to make sure we continue focusing on the institutional support. What we collectively call Title III and Title V, this is the funding that goes to our institutions from SIP, strengthening institution programs for under-resourced community colleges and other institutions, to our Hispanic serving institutions, HBCUs, tribal colleges, and many other MSIs, minority serving institutions. So we want to ensure that that conversation stays there, because if the program is not being talked about, it will likely be on the chopping block. And along those same lines, we also want to continue emphasizing the critical role that our institutions play in the workforce and the federal funding that is needed not just through strengthening community college training grants, as Jim mentioned, but also Perkins, CTE, National Science Foundation grants, adult basic education. So we want to continue emphasizing that this is not government expenditure that is being wasteful. These are funds that are having a direct impact on many of our communities. But I want to shift now away from the appropriations conversation to talk a little bit about some of the other priorities that are in our green sheet. Namely, one that has been, if you've been coming around for NLS for a long time, you know that this has been a perennial item for us, and that's supporting dreamers. Enacting legislation to provide a permanent solution and a pathway to citizenship to documented folks as well as other dreamers, as well as providing access to them to Title IV funds. Now, this is even more complicated now with a divided Congress and with a lot of varying opinions on our immigration issues. There was a last-minute grasp at the end of last Congress trying to get that done, and it fell through. But we also know that the DACA program is in unsafe standing at this moment. It's currently being litigated. It's going through the courts. It has once already been ruled that the administration exceeded their authority. The Biden administration tried to rectify that by going through the regulatory process to firm up the program, but that portion is also now being litigated. So we want to maintain this item in the green sheet because in the event that DACA is overturned and we have over 800,000 current recipients now in limbo, that hopefully will jolt Congress into action, and we want to ensure that our voices are being heard on this matter. So with that, I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you, Jose. Good morning, everyone, and thanks again for being here and for making our collective voice felt. This is the one time every year where everybody on Capitol Hill knows to expect their local community college to be in the offices. We always hear it from the staff, and it's really a great feeling from our perspective to know that the regularity of this one time in early February where the sector is here en masse is just a great thing, and we get a lot of momentum from the work that you do. As you all know, of course, you have to continue that work in the succeeding months as you go back home and hopefully meet with members on your campuses and in their district offices. I'm going to talk today about some issues that are contained in the Higher Education Act. That's the big law that creates the Pell Grant program, the loan programs, the institutional aid programs, many of the other federal discretionary annual programs that your colleges compete for and mean so much to you. But most importantly, the Higher Education Act is about student financial aid and providing the access that's represented in those programs. I think you've already gathered from just being aware of the general political environment that this year Congress is off to a slower start than it has been in other years. It's always slower getting started when there's a new Congress than when it's continuing on, as will be the case next year. So the issues I'm going to talk about, with one exception, the first one, are not issues that are currently right on the table that are before Congress with bill numbers or anything like that, but they're very important for you to raise with offices as being ongoing needs on our campuses with our students, and to give them some perspective about ways that you'd like to see federal policy change to advance things. And I'll just mention that, we're talking about reforming student aid is the title of this slide. The Higher Education Act has not been reauthorized since 2008. So that's 15 years since Congress has taken a comprehensive look at all the programs that are so critical to the mission of our institutions. 15 years. And it may not be another 15 years till they do it, but it's not clear when they're going to be able to get a bill done. Having said that, you heard mention of Dr. Virginia Fox, who's the returning chair of the Education and Workforce Committee. I know we have a strong North Carolina contingent here at the NLS. Dr. Fox Dr. Fox is going to keep us really busy this year. Carrie mentioned the oversight that she expects to do of the administration. She is extremely engaged, extremely interested in higher education. She'd like to change some aspects of it. So even though we're not exactly sure when a bill might be forthcoming, we do expect to see one. So the first issue I want to address is one that we are working on very intensively at this moment, and we hope that all of you will raise in offices. It's one that I'm sure most of you have raised in previous Congresses, and that is the issue of short-term Pell Grants. And we know how important it is to have these programs, many of them non-credit programs, financed with federal funds. We continue to hear from campus officials about the fact that the lack of funding for students in these programs prevents those students and other students from accessing them fully. And so we have put a tremendous amount of effort and energy into short-term Pell. We got close to enactment in the last Congress. We didn't succeed in doing that, so we're back at it again this year. Some people have asked, you know, why haven't you all gotten this done already? Haven't you been working on it a long time? And I just want to mention to you that this issue, even though it's a self-evident issue for our institutions, it seems quite obvious, logical, and commonsensical that the government providing all these billions and billions of dollars for all these programs across higher education doesn't provide just that little bit of extra for our short-term programs. One of the reasons why is that there's a lot of concern about the lack of data about these programs. You heard Zoe Baird mention that in the first session this morning. So to that end, anything that you can provide to offices, it may not be a lot of outcomes numbers, but just good examples of the impact these programs have in your communities would be very helpful for us. And one thing I'd like to add to that I think it's important for you to understand by way of context is that most higher education programs don't have to prove what their value is in order to receive federal funding. In fact, very few do. So it is in truth, it's a little bit of a double standard or a stricter standard that people would apply to these programs. And it's because I would say the long-time bias against training and education of short-term programs, and it doesn't have the glamour maybe or whatever association one has with longer academic programs, but we all know how valuable these are. So it's very important for you to go into offices, talk about these, and a little bit more concretely in terms of where we are. We've had the Jobs Act that's been introduced in both the House and the Senate now is on the slide. The Congresswoman Fox has introduced the Pell Act. It's her legislation. We expect to see a similar bill being introduced in the Senate very soon. So the environment is very, very ripe for getting this done. And we just ask you to keep pressing on it, keep talking about the value of these programs, and we think we can get it done in this 118th Congress. The next item on this slide relates to the issue of the basic needs of our students: food insecurity, housing insecurity, the need for our students to access funds beyond what the Title IV programs do for them. You heard a little bit about that from Secretary Vilsack this morning. We are trying to make it easier for our students through the student financial aid process and through the information that's required to be provided to them to access these programs. The reality is that our students who are eligible for SNAP and for other income maintenance programs access them at a lower level than other individuals do. Some of that is because of the rules, but a lot of it is because there's just not the adequate understanding. We know you're doing what you can to inform students about that. We're trying to have some changes made to federal policy that will ensure that the information is provided to all potentially eligible students. And then finally, there is a small program that was created just funded once in one funding cycle, the fiscal year 22 cycle, that would provide funding for basic needs for our students. A handful of our colleges receive those grants, and we're trying to expand that program. Next slide. Okay, the final two items that I'm going to mention in terms of higher ed, and then I'll mention a tax issue, and we'll get to closing here, relates to borrowing. And we could talk a lot about the issue of loan cancellation, income-driven repayment, but there's a particular community college issue that we have been advocating on that we want you to be aware of and raise in offices if your college is interested in this, and that is giving institutions flexibility to lower loan maximums. In a lot of cases, we think that our students should be advised and in some cases limited to borrowing, particularly in cases where they're only enrolled half-time or less than half-time, that we think that the full loan amounts probably aren't a good idea for our students to be borrowing in all cases if they're only taking a course or two. We want campuses to have that flexibility. And then the final issue in our higher education agenda is a very important one. It's a data issue. It's not particularly high profile, but it is an issue that is so important that and because so much hinges upon it. And that is our position that we believe that there should be a national, federal data system that tracks all higher education students at all institutions into college and into the workforce. And the reason why we think that's so important is that continually we are being asked to document the earnings and the post-completion outcomes of our students. And unfortunately, in many cases, we don't know what those outcomes are. Many of you at the state level and the campus level have done a good job of working with your state governments, in some cases with some counties, and other means of proving the earnings increases of your students after they've completed their programs. But the federal government can't do that. And I'm not going to go this morning, and we won't go into any detail about all the ways in which questions are being asked and accountability issues are being raised about the impact of higher education, but I'm sure you're all aware of it, of the national dialogue along these lines. And we think that we would be in a much more effective position of proving the impact of all of our programs and all of our students if we had a national system that, again, took students through college and then into the workforce. I'll also add that we don't know necessarily what happens to our students after they've left the institution and when they've enrolled in another one. We're relying upon state systems or the National Student Clearinghouse to track our students. If we had this national system in place, it wouldn't have to go to the clearinghouse. The federal government would be able to monitor what happens to students once they've enrolled in another institution. So that's a bit about our top priorities in the area of the Higher Education Act policies. And then finally, I wanted to talk about a tax issue. And this is another issue that we worked on very intensively in the last Congress. We also got it really close to the finish line, but didn't get it enacted. And so, again, we're raising this issue. And that concerns the taxation of Pell Grants and the way that that policy interacts with the American Opportunity Tax Credit. And illogically enough, the federal government kind of gives with one hand in the Pell Grant and takes it away in the other by taxing Pell Grants for the non-tuition and fees expenses that students incur. So the average community college student is now paying $3,860 tuition. The Pell Grant maximum goes up to $7,395 this July 1. The difference that a student has, the again, tuition and fees amount, can be taxed. And if you can think of anything that makes less sense than taxing a very needy student's Pell Grant, you know, I challenge you. We'll have Q&A after. You can raise that. We just think it's a very wrong-headed policy, and we're trying to change that. And I would note that the reason why it's our issue is because other sectors, their tuitions are so high, their tuitions swallow up the Pell Grant. You know, the average public four-year college charges over $10,000 now, so they don't have to worry about this issue because all their Pell Grant money is going to tuition. It's not that way for community colleges, and that's why it's our issue. And then finally, and this gets a little bit technical, but it's worth understanding because there's a lot of money at stake for our students, is that the way the American Opportunity Tax Credit is structured, and it has to do with the way the Pell Grant is treated for tax purposes, the AOTC, as we call it, $2,500 a year, it's calculated in a way that you take the student's tuition and fees and you subtract the Pell Grant amounts that they receive, and only then are they eligible for any of this $2,500 tax credit. So if you take that, let's say a $4,000 tuition that a student pays, if they get a Pell Grant, they get zero AOTC. A Pell Grant of $4,000, they get no AOTC. A student whose parents earn $160,000 a year, who write a $30,000 tuition check, let's say for a private college, they get $2,500. And we say, Where is the equity in that? How can it be that somebody who's an upper middle class or upper class person gets $2,500 and a poor community college student, very low income community college student, gets nothing because of the way this formula works? We want to see that change. So legislation's been introduced in the last Congress. Again, we got really close. I won't take time to go into the history of that, but we are pressing to make Pell Grants free and allowing our Pell Grant students to get the $2,500 that almost 10 million other students in higher education receive because it's their due, and they need these funds at least as much as the other students do. So those are my issues for this morning, and then I'll turn things over to Carrie, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. And thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, David. We're going to tackle one more issue, and then we are going to move to the Q&A portion, so start thinking about your questions. This year, new to the Green Sheet and new to our legislative priorities for the 118th Congress is the Farm Bill. I'm excited that we've added this year, and that's one of the reasons why we invited Secretary Vilsack to come address everyone this morning, so that we could hear about these two issues that he spoke about. So two main points under the Farm Bill. First, supporting rural community colleges, a proposal here to create a federal funding stream for community colleges to help support rural economic development, particularly in agriculture. For those who may not be familiar with the Farm Bill, the four-year land grant institutions have an agricultural research set aside within that bill, within that law, and given the increasing technological complexity of farming and our agricultural industry, there are many community colleges in rural communities that are now providing programs to train workers who are working in those fields, and this would support community colleges in developing those new programs. And then second, increasing access to SNAP. We know there are a couple challenges within the SNAP program. One is just the complexity of applying for it and helping students to understand that they are eligible. The much-cited GAO report from about 2019 showed that more than half of eligible SNAP recipients aren't actually applying for the program. And then when COVID hit, there was a relaxation, as Secretary Vilsack spoke about, of some of the SNAP requirements for students, which allowed easier access to the SNAP program, and those will now be sunsetting this year with the declaration that the pandemic, from a government policy standpoint, is over as of May. And so pursuing the Farm Bill for SNAP benefits is really an opportune time. The Farm Bill is reauthorized every 5 years, and it currently expires at the end of September. And unlike the Higher Education Act, it is actually reauthorized on time pretty much every cycle. And that is because it has strong bipartisan support, and it includes both our food safety net, but also many commodities and agricultural policies that would just have really severe ramifications across our economy and food safety net if it isn't reauthorized. So Congress on both sides of the aisle are very motivated in getting it done. So given our expansion in focus on basic needs and our quest to kind of look for pieces of legislation that have bipartisan support that will pass during this Congress, the Farm Bill is really a good opportunity for us to be able to make impact for both our campuses and our students within a piece of legislation that we do expect to pass. So with that, that ends the formal presentation. We are now going to go to 10 minutes of Q&A. So I'm going to move back to the podium so that I can see the microphones. I would ask you to get up and move to the microphones to ask your questions. And if we could get the lights turned up so that everyone can see while they move around, that would be very helpful. Thank you. All right, there we come with the lights. We'll start with my right, center right here, and then we'll move to this question next. Please, sir.
Well, good morning. I'm Ken Atwater from Hillsborough Community College in Florida. And David, this question just for you, and just to remind me, but short-term Pell eligibility requirements now, is it 600 clock hours as it is
Yes, it's 600 clock hours, which translates into about 2/3 of a year, a program of about 15 weeks. So programs that are shorter than that
Right.
do not qualify for federal student aid. So it encompasses a lot of our certificate programs as well as pretty much all of our non-credit programs.
Even if those short-term programs are industry certified, they are still not eligible, right?
That's correct. And one of the issues that we're working with staff on is trying to figure out some way to incorporate those industry certifications into eligibility standards, because we know that so many of our colleges, direct their programs towards that.
All right, thank you.
And the bills would bring that 600 number down to 150 clock hours in terms of eligibility.
Hi, Michael Wood, Delta College, Michigan, trustee. What are the odds of getting a national unit student record? I've been pushing for this since the 1970s through institutional research at state and national levels. And now I'm retired and a trustee. Is it going to happen?
We hope eventually. What I will say this is the new chair in the House Education and Workforce Committee vehemently opposes the idea on the principle of student privacy. There are bills like the College Transparency Act, which both of our organizations have endorsed in previous Congresses, that have sought to address that concern and ensuring that there are guardrails around student privacy. Unfortunately, that has not been enough to dissuade her, and so there are some challenges at the leadership level in convincing them to get that through the finish line.
Thank you.
I feel your pain on that, but I just want to say, in order to keep you from leaving in complete despair, is that this is, and it's important for people to know, this is a bipartisan bill. Both houses, both parties have very broad support for this legislation. That what Jose just said is absolutely true. Dr. Fox is adamantly opposed about this on grounds of privacy, which from our perspective, at this point in time, is not a legitimate reason at all to not support this, because when you consider the privacy safeguards that exist, for one thing, when you also consider the information that students provide through the Title IV programs, which is, well, I know I'm preaching to the choir on this, but that the same type of information is already being provided by the 70+% of students who get financial aid. So the notion that there's some sort of big government involvement in digging into the personal data of college students as a result of creating this is just it's absolutely just not true. And so that's the reason why we're continuing to arguing for it, and that's why the vast majority of members of Congress, again, both parties, both houses, support this legislation.
And I don't want to be the Debbie Downer, so let me give you one sliver of hope. The new ranking member in the Senate, Ranking Member Cassidy, is the lead for the College Transparency Act in the Senate, so there's some hope there.
All right, I am currently seeing 2 more questions, and we have 6 minutes. So I'm going to take these 2 questions, and then we'll close out the session.
Hi, my name is Jasmine McDaniel. I'm student trustee at Carl Sandburg College in Galesburg, Illinois. And I know you guys have mentioned minority serving institutions and the funding. However, I wanted to ask, what are ways you are trying to strengthen those benefits? Because I do follow under the minority. I also follow in the unique category of middle class, where we barely receive any grants, funding for that matter. So just how many ways you are trying to strengthen those?
So there's a couple of ways we're trying to address that. Oftentimes we try to focus on Title III and Title V funds, which are funds directly to the institutions that serve minority-serving students, like historically black colleges and universities, predominantly black institutions, Hispanic-serving institutions, NFPCs, and so on. We want to ensure that those institutions have the resources they need to provide students with support and services on campus. So that's oftentimes what we do on that end, and in addition to that, we try to focus on the other end on expanding student aid, like David mentioned earlier.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Michelle Johnson. I, too, am from Carl Sandburg College in Galesburg, Illinois. One of the questions that we have had as we talk about Pell is we were participants in the dual credit Pell program, and that is going away. Our district is 3,000 square miles of rural farmland in which we served 102 dual credit students just last year through this Pell Grant. What is the opportunities that we have to have dual credit Pell really reinstated?
I'll take the first stab at that one. So I believe you were able to provide that dual credit Pell through the experimental site that the Department of Education was running. So there are two options. The department can choose to extend it. I will admit that I would need to look up to see where they are in that timeline. But the department did extend the Second Chance Pell experimental site several times, and that helped build the evidence for Congress to then eventually pass that program. But in order for the dual credit Pell to become permanent, Congress does need to pass legislation in order for that to happen. And so that's, kind of part of the big bucket of what we're talking about here, of how motivated Congress is to be able to come to agreement to pass those in a bipartisan way.
That's great, because our dual credit is actually workforce development, healthcare, as well as prep for transfer to four-year institutions, as well as our own. So it aligns with some of the initiatives you've talked about today.
Great, thank you. All right, I see one more question. I think we can squeeze it in, and then we will break for lunch.
Thank you. I'm Tammy Silver, a trustee at Pasadena City College in California. I have a question. If you've ever pursued a thought of splitting funding from for-profit schools versus publicly supported schools. For-profit schools often have a much higher tuition with lamentable outcomes that leave many students mired in debt, and our schools don't. So is there any way that that could give more funding to us? And are you thinking about bringing that idea to legislators?
So that idea is already there, and it's an ongoing conversation, and I'll tell you that is actually one of the challenges we're facing right now with Workforce Pell, in that the Jobs Act, a bipartisan bill, excludes eligibility for for-profit programs. Chairwoman Fox vehemently opposes that. She believes that everyone should be eligible, and so in the Pell Act, all institutions that meet the criteria are eligible, whether they're public or private, or private for-profit. There are some distinctions, and of course we want as much funding to go to our institutions because we know our institutions are doing good work and are meeting the students and giving the students the opportunities they need. Unfortunately, in this Congress, that is a conversation that is going to be problematic.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, while for-profits are fully ensconced in the student aid programs and have been for some time now, and that is one big reason we're having this discussion and argument between the parties that Jose just mentioned in terms of short-term Pell, because it would be a deviation from the norm for for-profit institutions not to be eligible for a portion of the Pell Grant program. But beyond that, one thing to keep in mind is that for-profits are often not eligible for many of the grant programs that that we're talking about. A lot of them refer back to Section 101 of the Higher Education Act, which is just the publics and the private nonprofits. So that concept is there already, and then we saw a little bit more of that in terms of the HERE funding that went to institutions, because in there we had for-profit institutions had very limited eligibility there, and in fact all the money that went to them was earmarked for student grants. So on a conceptual level anyway, in terms of the question that was asked, there is a lot of that already in terms of what we're seeing, but the short-term Pell is in a way a bit of an experiment to see whether or not there's and certainly on parts of some, there's not an appetite to extend that concept into the student aid area itself.
Thank you. This brings us to the end of our priority session today. As a reminder, we do need everyone to exit quickly. The doors will reopen for those who have luncheon tickets at 12:15. Please join me in thanking my fellow panelists.